Yes, welcome to Late Night with David Letterman. All right, the last part, part one. We're on slide 24. So as all these things were happening, and it appeared that the Chinese nationalists were taking down the communists and that China would become united, the Japanese were not too thrilled. The Western powers were a little bit happier because they believed, their analysts, their leaders believed that this would result in stability that would advance business interests and lead to peaceful relations in the region. However, the Japanese were not so sure, and the reason they were not so sure was that there was growing discontent in the Chinese population, in particular amongst young people, at the actions of Japan through the years, and at Japan's continued presence and apparent desire to expand in Manchuria and beyond. There had been, for example, a Battle of Shanghai in 1932, when, as outlined in the readings, when the Japanese Army and Navy fought the Chinese Army, and the two of them fought each other to a standstill, and the Japanese eventually had to withdraw for political reasons from Shanghai. They remained in Shanghai with a rather large concession in the northern part of the city, and there were boycotts of Japanese goods and growing demands for Chiang Kai-shek to confront the Japanese and make them retreat from Chinese territory, because they had military bases in different parts of China, of course, including Qingdao, where the beer comes from, and where the only good chocolate came from before the 1990s in China, because of its former German colony status. And so there were all these boycotts, all these actions going on, many of which were organized, of course, by the communists, but also by some in the nationalist side. And the Japanese were becoming increasingly nervous about what might result afterwards. At the same time, there was militancy on the Japanese side. There were patriotic associations, as you see in the Beasley reading, that were on the rise. A number of them, but the most famous and the most effective of them was the Koku Ryokai, or the Black Dragon Society. Black Dragon is the name in Chinese of the river that runs between the present-day Chinese northeast and the Soviet Far East, Russia. In English, it's also known as the Amur River, so therefore this Black Dragon Society was known as the Amur Society. And they sought to extend Japanese influence throughout Manchuria, and into Mongolia, and into Siberia, the Soviet Far East. During this time, they began an assassination campaign against public figures in Japan who did not want this sort of thing to go on. Public figures in the foreign ministry, and they even assassinated a prime minister, as you'll see in the Beasley reading. And this resulted in an increasingly assertive and independent Imperial Japanese Army, and an increasingly fearful and shrinking Japanese central government. Let's go on to slide 25. The IJA, the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria, was especially independent and militant. There are young officers, in particular, who belonged to some of these societies and wanted to see stronger action. Were motivated not only by the patriotic imperative of expanding and becoming a more powerful nation. They were also motivated by the idea that society, as it was led by the current leaders of the country, not the emperor, mind you, who was the symbol of that they all cherished, but the people who had been the Genro. That's spelled G-E-N-R-O, the Genro. This is mentioned in Beasley. The oligarchs who had been the power brokers behind party politics in Japan, who were now dying out. The last of the Genro, I think, was only effective as a politician through the late 20s. And by that time, he no longer had the sort of power that they had had before, where they could basically dictate, after elections were held, who would be appointed prime minister and so on. So increasingly, because the Genro who had put first in their interests, the interests of the nation as they saw them anyway, now the people who were most influential in politics were business people, heads of the big zaibatsus like Mitsubishi. And in the Beasley reading, you'll notice that there was a foreign minister who was married to the daughter of a Mitsubishi senior executive, and who therefore was interested in making sure that Japanese business interests were protected in the conduct of Japanese policy, not only at home, but most especially overseas, where it could run into the hostility of foreign powers that did not want such quick Japanese expansion, or any Japanese expansion at all, against their own spheres of influence. And so the Imperial Japanese Army, with this dual motivation of expanding the nation's power and purifying it, cleaning it up from corrupt business interests, began to act on its own. They assassinated Zhang Zuolin without any orders from Tokyo, in order to destabilize the situation and make it easier for them to expand their power from the areas that they held along the coast in Manchuria throughout the whole region. And indeed, step by step, they were able to do that. They gradually, during this period in the late 20s, forced the Manchurian army, now headed by Zhang Zuolin's son, Zhang Xueliang, out of Manchuria. They had to retreat into North China. And when they were ready, they started another, they manufactured another incident, supposedly a sabotage of a rail line outside of the major city of Mukden, now called Shenyang, and followed up on that by immediately invading the rest of Manchuria and throwing Zhang Xueliang and his Manchurian army out once and for all. Let's go on to slide 26. So during this period, the communists had been forced out of the cities. Now the Central Committee members, who had been calling the shots as best they could from Shanghai, were now in Ruijin, in Jiangxi province, living under the tender mercies of Mao Zedong. He was working for them on paper, but he was the one who controlled the military at this time. And over the course of 1933 and into 1934, he was voted out of military command by the Central Committee and had to stand aside for a little while. And when the Long March began in October of 1934, he did not have any authority. That was soon to change. In the meantime, The KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, had begun a series of encirclement or annihilation campaigns, and although these didn't always work very well, they did gradually tighten the noose around the communist positions. They might have been successful if it were not for one man, this guy here, Mo Xiong, who was a long-term agent of the Chinese Special Services, the TK, as they were called, the Central Committee Special Section. He had been an agent of the TK for about 3 years at this point, and when he saw what was going on with the 5th Encirclement Campaign that was under plan, he was a staff officer at the center of it all. He ended up contacting his underground contacts who came in with him for a midnight meeting and stayed up all night, copying down the details of this extremely detailed plan to surround the communist positions and move in on them. This was all translated into secret writing inside of some dictionaries, and a man who disguised himself as a teacher then walked out of the area and made his way to the communist lines with his dictionaries with invisible secret writing on them. These were read in the communist area, and they decided to move ahead and break out. And this is how they made their miraculous breakout. It was not due to some sort of superior military tactical prowess. It was because they had inside information. Let's go on to slide 27. And so began the long march that took 13 months, from October 1934 to November 1935, a mistake on my PowerPoint. So they started with about 100,000 troops from these 3 different locations, and they had lost almost all of them by the time they made it to the area of Yan'an, which was then under nationalist control. They occupied another area close by. So there were 2 major leadership fights along the way. The first leadership fight, 3 months after they started, ejected the Comintern advisor who had been directing military tactics up until that point, and Mao Zedong was promoted to take joint leadership of the armed forces with Zhou Enlai. The second major leadership fight occurred when one of the communist commanders decided to go his own way, but eventually he was forced back into the fold, and Mao became the dominant military leader. Now, this did not mean he was the dominant political leader at this point. That took him several more years, and we'll talk more about that in part 2 of this lecture. When I say the Comintern loses some influence, they were no longer calling all the shots. Now, Mao Zedong became the man who was making the military decisions, and Stalin would eventually recognize him as the preeminent leader, although that would take 4 more years. Let's go on to slide 28. So when they arrived in the northwest, it took them a little while to consolidate their position and reach Yan'an. That came after the Xi'an incident, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But what they had now was a base that was remote from nationalist military attention. It gave them, their military forces and their intelligence structure, the first opportunity to rest, regroup, and reorganize. They had lost so many people, it was unbelievable. They went, again, from about 100,000 down to 10,000 people. They began a propaganda drive to gain sympathizers in China and abroad. This picture on the bottom, for example, here, The Philip Jaffe group that came in, he's second from the left. Mr. Jaffe later became an agent of the GRU, of Soviet Military Intelligence, in New York City after World War II was over with. They began this propaganda drive to gain sympathizers, and although it was not all smooth sailing, this time in Yan'an proved crucial to their later victory. Let's go on to slide 29. So a year later, in December of 1936, Chiang Kai-shek had become increasingly upset with Zhang Xueliang, as I mentioned a while ago, because of Zhang Xueliang's continual insistence that the nationalists reconcile with the communists and face up to the Japanese threat. The Generalissimo was not convinced, although public pressure was coming at him from all sides to confront the Japanese and begin to fight them. He was not convinced that his side would win any such confrontation, and indeed he proved to be right on that score, because once the Sino-Japanese War began in July of 1937, things did not go very well for the nationalists. The Japanese made a very rapid advance. In any case, in December of 1936, the Generalissimo had decided that he needed to go and have a stern talking to with the young marshal, Zhang Xueliang. He flew against the advice of his advisors to Xi'an in central western China proper to have a pep talk with both Zhang and another warlord who was in the vicinity named Yang Hucheng, in order to get them in line. However, unexpectedly, on the part of everybody, including the communists, Zhang Xueliang and Yang Hucheng decided to arrest Chiang Kai-shek and demand that he reinstate the CCP-KMT United Front. Mao was absolutely ecstatic with happiness. He thought that this would be a chance to arrest Chiang Kai-shek, put him on trial in the communist headquarters, and sentence him to death for his turning against the communist movement in April of 1927 and killing so many of his comrades. However, when Stalin found out about this, he telegrammed Mao Zedong and ordered that Chiang Kai-shek be saved and allowed to lead a united China against Japan so that they would not turn their attention toward Siberia and Russia. Mao was furious, but he knew where the money was coming from, and he also was following communist discipline. So he changed tack and worked through his agents on Zhang Xueliang's staff to have Chiang Kai-shek released. So he was released and convinced Zhang Xueliang to come back to his headquarters in Nanking, where he promptly arrested the young marshal and purged his Manchurian army and integrated them into the KMT army, so there was no more funny stuff in the future. Let's go on to slide 30. So now the Japanese are pissed. They can see what's coming. They realize that China will soon unite, and that making further progress there may become impossible. And so, as they grow more and more wary of a united China, again, the military steps in, and through it's a bit of a controversy whether it was purposeful or whether it was a series of accidents. But there was a shootout outside of Beijing to where the Japanese had advanced at this point, slowly but surely, that led to a broader conflict, and eventually, in August of 1937, a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. Again, it was the military that was out front, whether they were bumbling or whether they were carefully advancing and pulling the government along with them. nonetheless, they were the driving force, the Imperial Japanese Army, in moving history toward this terrible confrontation that cost millions and millions of lives. We'll continue to talk about this in part 2. Thank you very much.